My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. Today we will be talking with Dr. Darcia Narvaez, a professor of psychology at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Narvaez also writes a blog for Psychology Today called Moral Landscapes. She has also written a book titled Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality. In this episode, we discuss the importance of nurturing our young as human animals, how this connects to our moral being, and how we regard the natural world.
These things develop naturally. It's part of the whole system, from the early nest through the adolescent nest, through the nest of adults, where there's lots of community rituals and practices that help you stay focused and connected. What you fear in traditional wisdom, in westernized industrial civilization, is you fear your animal nature.
Dr. Narvaez's research reveals just how incredibly vital Indigenous practices are for the planet and our well-being, and how we can learn from what nature requires of different species to bring about healthy, fully developed, and fully balanced living beings into the world. Join me again to discover our primal nest. So happy to be able to speak with you today, Dr. Darcia Narvaez. How is it that you came to do this wonderful research that you do?
Well, I have a checkered history because I'm in my 7th career. So I've been searching for truth and for, I guess, beauty and life for decades, and thinking that I was in the arts at first. I was a music major and organist, choir director, music teacher, went into theology, and then worked with the Hispanic community for a while, and then did middle school teaching, and then started my PhD, finding that ethics and the development of ethics and moral understanding was really what I wanted to study. And so I got my PhD in that. And then after a while in that field, the focus was on reasoning, and thinking. And after reading widely anthropology and neuroscience, I realized, well, that's just a little tiny piece of who we are, morality-wise. And so I found all these pieces that fit together now in the jigsaw puzzle of how humans become human, what's important for humans to develop their full potential. And that's the kind of thing I study now. And it's guided by all sorts of interdisciplinary research and especially by Indigenous knowledge and awareness and understanding of the world, which we sort of forgot in the Western world and industrialized civilization.
I often tell people that I was a born naturalist. That is who I am. That is what I've become. But I really believe that we're all naturalists. I think we all have this innate connection to nature. But growing up, one of my earliest observations was this apparent disconnect between humans and the non-human natural world.
Yeah.
There was this prevalent apathetic mindset of all things non-human.
Yeah.
This collective view that annihilation of other creatures and other living beings in our biosphere was considered normal. It didn't make sense to me. Absolutely everything was revolved around the human species. So you present Indigenous practices on becoming and being human, and you connect this on how our views of what we consider normal has changed in terms of behavior. Can you explain why this is important in terms of human child rearing, children and adult behavior as it relates to our culture?
So since civilization began, we've undermined child development more and more. So that's with agricultural societies, settled societies, living in cities then too, began to not provide what the normal expected developmental system is for our species. And we've decreased that support over time, and especially lately in the United States, it's horrendous. And so we shouldn't be surprised when people are dysregulated and disordered and self centered, because that's a sign of underdeveloped and misdeveloped neurobiology. Because you have to have a good biological beginning, which is uh, actually co constructed by your social experience. And so our species evolved out of the social mammalian line, which is over 30 million years old, and that line has a very intensive set of parenting practices, practices that foster proper development of every system in the body. So it's really a biopsychosocial developmental system. And this nest is intense for us. And so it's a community provided nest, not just mom, not just mom and dad, but it's a community of grandparents and aunts and uncles and other non kin who support the child's development. And those kinds of characteristics then include soothing birth experience, soothing perinatal, pregnancy, gestational experience, and responsiveness to the needs of the baby to keep them in optimal arousal condition while the brain is rapidly developing itself. We're born at full term birth with only 25% of adult brain volume, and most of that brain grows in those first few years based on experience. So lots of epigenetic things are happening. Genes are being turned on and off according to sensitive periods. And based on care. So then there's breastfeeding, several years of breastfeeding. It's tailored to the needs of the baby, as male or female, whether they're in a growth spurt or not. And our milk is thin, so it needs to be ingested frequently. So breastfeeding is really important. Average age of weaning is 4 years old in our species. Uh, and then we have multiple adult caregivers, responsive caregivers, which I mentioned, a positive social support for mom and baby, positive climate. The baby feels like they belong, they're welcomed, free play with others, self-directed play, especially with multiple age playmates in nature, and then lots of affectionate touch. So those are the things that we study, and now I'm splitting out into its separate component, nature connection, because that is such a missing piece of who we are now, and civilized
Mm-hmm.
nations become alienated from the natural world and from our very nature of being earth creatures.
Yeah. Yep. And that's how I felt as a child. I was the one, I was always outside, always in the woods, always roaming. Didn't want to be indoors.
Lucky
Just wanted to
you.
look around, just wanted to play, just
Yep.
wanted to flip rocks and logs and just be out there. I mean, I think that's who we are. I feel
Yes.
like we've lost our innateness,
Yeah.
like just our natural abilities that keep us, just those natural abilities that we've disconnected ourselves as we've wrapped ourselves around this reality of artificiality.
Right. Lived
And
built environments. Yeah.
yeah, and as you said, once we are more oriented towards materialism than these more meaningful natural connections.
And
And
there's a reason for that. So, this nest in early life fosters the development of the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere of the brain is scheduled to grow more rapidly in early life, and it's the seat of self control, self regulation, empathy, foresight, higher consciousness, all sorts of things that when you don't get that nest and that responsive care in early life, that brain, that part of yourself is underdeveloped. And part of that is also connected to nature, to be able to be receptively intelligent to the natural world, to pick up on the signals, to understand, the birds and the trees and the winds, all that is right hemisphere directed too. And so we've undermined all that in order to create people who will put up with drudgery That's what happens when you undermine the self, the development of the self, right? You have a half human person who's desperate, who feels desperately insecure. And so what do? You provide them with distractions. You provide them with work, so they can feel rewarded, and
Yeah.
always anxious, but always searching, right? And so then you fill
Yeah.
them with all these distracting kinds of activities.
And what we're talking about here is this concept that you've coined, the evolved nest.
Yes.
The nest has different biosocial components because we are biosocial creatures. So, how does this link to moral development and these recent behaviors such as anxiety and other behaviors that we think are normal?
So what happens, that right hemisphere is really important for social capacities, and there's so much that happens just moment by moment for a baby that's growing so rapidly. Thousands or millions of synapses a second are growing in early life with good care. And if the baby's stressed, like if you leave them alone, that's very stressful for a social mammal, or you leave them to cry, you're actually melting synapses. The cortisol levels, when they get too high, they melt those synapses, and the stuff that's supposed to be growing doesn't grow. So, what's supposed to be growing is this social capacities of being able to recognize other people's facial expressions and movements, and being kind of tuned in body to body in conversational ways that babies can do this before they can talk. And there's so many pieces of that that are relevant to moral functioning later. So, what happens when you build a brain that is underdeveloped, they're going to be easily stressed because you've now laid the groundwork and the routes. You've lubricated pathways to being stress reactive. If you leave babies to cry, leave them alone.
Gosh,
Don't
that's every human today.
No, I know we're really sick now. So when you're stress reactive, the blood flow shifts away from your higher order thinking. You're not going to be open minded or open hearted. You're just thinking about self protection. The blood flow goes to your muscles, right? So you can run away. That's, our heritage as animals, to be able to protect ourselves in extreme danger. But what we've done is we put people into chronic situations of threat. And so they're always in crisis mode, essentially. And so babies then, instead of being able to be calm and present, emotionally aware and receptive and relationally attuned to others in the present moment, they learn to shut down. And we all have learned to brace ourselves against the world, which doesn't lead to self-actualization. You undermine yourself that way. And instead of being open and taking risks to be, move in love instead of fear.
And you've actually observed this amazing thing that the Western society might find incredibly remarkable, but that babies born into Indigenous societies don't cry.
Yeah.
They are truly secure.
Yeah.
It's not something that they do.
That's right. So what happens when you don't provide the nest is that you break the continuum of feeling safe in the world, that you're part of life. And that feeling of being connected and earth bound, is just part of every other animal's background, unless they've been traumatized by human intervention. And that's what we do immediately to babies at birth. We traumatize them, and they already now have broken that continuum. Jean Liedloff's book, The Continuum Concept, gives lots of illustrations of this. It's a good book to read. But we then immediately we primally wound our babies, and they feel ever after insecure very deeply. And they can't identify why, because in those first years, you don't have verbalizable knowledge. You're building all your implicit awareness of the world, your unconscious, how you're going to actually relate to the world is built then. And so you can easily undermine that self, that individual spirit, when you don't provide the nest.
In the nest, one of the components is touch, and today we think it's completely normal. It's totally normal to push your baby around in a stroller, put them in a crib or a playpen, and just walk away. No wonder so many people are so touchy and competitive. It's like this sense of breaking from this sort of modern rearing bondage. And yet you can see so beautifully in these indigenous-like cultures, the baby is not a burden. It's
Right.
You carry the baby with you. It's on your body almost always. You see people gathering while their baby is on their back. I mean, their hands are still free. They can still do these things. And
Right.
with the babies with them, it's just a
Hmm.
part of them.
Yeah, and you enjoy it too. You want to be with that baby.
It's beautiful, but like in Western societies, it's like you don't want to touch your baby.
Right.
So, can you talk about the touch aspect a little more?
Yeah, so I think what's happened, we've got increasing avoidant attachment being, and probably disorganized and other kinds of insecure attachment that the adults now have. And so they really don't want to touch their babies. It's not pleasurable to them because they weren't touched when they were children. They were not attended to in the natural species typical way. And so they perpetuate this, actually a downward spiral of making things worse and worse for children and for our society. And touch is really important for all sorts of systems. The research with animals, we can't do experiments really with babies so much, accidentally. With animals, it shows that the mother's presence, physical touch, regulates all sorts of systems, the heart rate, breathing. Babies who die of SIDS often die because they are separated from the caregiver. The caregiver sometimes has to wake them up if they stop breathing, which there are anecdotes about that. So it's not only those systems in the moment, but the long-term functioning of several systems, like the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, runs to all the major systems of the body. If it doesn't get set properly by good parenting in early life, you can have seizures, irritable bowel, breathing problems, heart problems, all sorts of things come from the poor functioning vagus nerve, and it's related to morality and social capacities. If the vagus nerve is not fostered to myelinate, then you have trouble calming yourself down and becoming intimate with others. You have trouble being compassionate. Your social engagement system doesn't work properly.
I really want our listeners to understand how the evolved nest is compared to other species, because in other non-human species, since their innate nurturing and rearing habits are intact, they bring about fully developed, fully functioning typical offspring. So, can you elaborate on how Indigenous practices bring about species typical culture, whereas the westernized society that we live in bring about species atypical culture?
Yes, so species atypical child raising is the industrialized way, the civilized way, and it's just gotten worse and worse as we get very robotic. We become robopaths. We don't think emotions matter, it's just thinking. We don't think actually too much thinking matters either. Just do your work, So that's the kind of people we're creating. Don't, shut up
It
and do
is
your
true,
work.
yeah.
Don't be individual. Don't be unique. Don't be creative, too creative, except in these little boundaries, right? So the species typical nest, which I've mentioned the characteristics for humans, bring about a well functioning individual, a smart individual, a well adapted to the group individual, cooperative individuals. That's what we see in other animals. And when you do experiments on animals and you separate them in strange ways, like Harry Harlow did with monkeys back in the mid-century, 20th
Yeah.
century, he actually accidentally found this out. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, came to visit his lab and said, "Hey, you're raising young monkeys in their own cages? That's very atypical for the species." Right? Oh, really? Yeah, so they need mother care. So they did all these experiments on mother care and mother deprivation and found, whoa, well, their brain doesn't develop very well. They can't get along with anybody. They're just turned into autistic, aggressive individuals because they miss the sensitive periods that require mother's presence. And so we've undermined mothering. Patriarchy has done this. Negative patriarchy has done this to undermine the value of mothers. People don't want to really talk about mothering because women now, because of the emphasis in feminism on, work, be as good as a man at work,
Yep.
mothering is like, oh, nah, it doesn't matter. So there's all
Yeah.
these rationalizations. Recent book, Crib Sheet, does this, where it misuses science to support neglecting babies.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, I guess I would like my listeners to really understand why the idea of the nest is so important as far as the amount of time this nurturing takes place in the nest, because we are essentially born quite immature as human beings.
Yes, so at full term birth, most babies aren't aren't allowed to stay in the womb full term anymore. But at full term birth, it's 25% of the adult brain volume. We actually look like fetuses of other animals till we're 18 months of age. That means we can't walk around, all our brain bones are not solidified even around that time. For example, the head, the skull is not solidified till around that time because it's supposed to grow a lot. And what helps it grow, the brain grow a lot? Touch, responsiveness, play, breast milk, all the nest components lead to a bigger, better brain. So we look like fetuses till 18 months, and we forgot that. And the civilized nations forgot that, right? Oh, baby's just born, leave them alone till they grow up and, force them into independence because look how dependent they are. That's such a misunderstanding. Should be in the womb another 18 months. Okay, so treat them gently, at least provide their needs, and they tell you what they need. And you don't want them to get into a pattern of having to scream to get their needs met because now you're developing a very annoying personality. So parent care develops the personality of the child. You might have an irritable baby because of stress during pregnancy or some epigenetic inheritance from prior generations of anxiety and things. Well, but the parents can move in and be responsive and keep that baby on their bodies, keep them connected, and keep them fed with breast milk on request. And this is every 20 minutes or so for a newborn. Their stomachs are very tiny. Our milk is very thin, needs to be ingested frequently. All these things contribute then to creating a cooperative personality, which is what we see in all these societies who provide the nest. The adults are cooperative, generous, calm. It's like wise when they live to older ages, right? It's like, what happened to those people in our society?
You've mentioned that even Darwin observed that nature is mostly cooperative, not competitive.
That's right. Competition is a thin layer. Now, more and more scientists are talking about the cooperation. Even forests are communities, and the mother trees
Mm-hmm.
feed through their roots the trees, baby trees of other species, even. I mean, it's just a
Uh-huh.
whole cooperative system. It's so complex.
Yeah. I haven't flown very much recently, but recently I picked up my partner from the airport and noticed that the airports had breastfeeding stations. And I thought,
Yeah.
wow, that's really strange. I used to observe women breastfeeding as a child and thought that was completely
Yeah.
normal. So it's kind of even mind boggling to me that even women perceive that as indecent behavior. And we
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we are mammals, and the word mammals actually is derived from the Latin word that means breast, mammary glands. I mean, we're mammals. This is what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, we've sexualized breasts now. So, because I think in part because men in our industrialized societies haven't gotten enough breast milk. Boys need more of the nest than girls, and because they mature more slowly, they have less built-in resilience. Alan Shore has pointed this out in his paper, All Our Sons. And so boys are longing for that breast, right? And they do it throughout their lives because they didn't get enough breast milk. And I think our obsession with sugar is also related to that because breast milk is very sweet. And so we spend our lives seeking sugar, many of us, and it could be, and this is speculation, could be related to the fact we didn't get enough breast milk at the time we needed it to build our brain and body.
As you've written and studied, the nurturing that comes from this evolved nest is equivalent to other species' habits, such as licking, which would be the equivalent of human cuddling or touch. And other species don't cut their care in that nurturing period short like humans now do. I often think about what people consider as good parenting and that kids need to be bought all these things, and that's what makes you a great provider. We create this idea that kids need all these things, which fuels our terrible consumerism habits. And the fact is, kids aren't as monetarily expensive as we've made them out to be. Where the expense should be spent is in this nurturing period of the nest.
Yes, we've got it all upside down. We think that uh, if you respond to the baby's needs, that you're going to spoil the baby. Actually, if you don't respond, you're going to ruin the baby, and you have forever after. Haven't dependent, whiny, potentially insecure child. You'll have to helicopter them all through their life, right? Because they don't have the self confidence. You've undermined the period for building that self confidence in those early years. So it's all upside down. In part, it's rationalization. The adults don't really want to hold the baby because they're distracted with their own work because they didn't get held. They don't have a feeling of bonding. Birth practices, medicalized birth, if you separate, the mom and baby are ready to bond. Their hormones are all ready right after birth to bond to each other. This is naturalistic birth. If you've been given drugs, the mom, or you separate the baby, you've undermined that bonding time. And so forever
Mm-hmm.
after, it's not quite the same as the glue, that magnetic glue where you want to keep the baby on your body because you're
Yeah.
so bonded. I mean, that's the normal thing, and we forgot that.
I've actually been told by a woman that she was given drugs during the time of birth, and she doesn't even remember the baby being handed to her, and so that period of bonding
Yeah,
was definitely
yeah.
disrupted.
It's really, but treating people like machines. We are
Yeah.
not machines, and our early experience really, really matters for the trajectory of our lives.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which brings me to my next point. You've talked about how truly our morality is not grounded in reality anymore, and the differences between indigenous or primal wisdom and the lack of wisdom that we have today that our lives should have otherwise led us to.
Right. So our morality, because we're disconnected from developing our emotions well, our emotion systems get kind of messed up. We enhance rage and fear systems in our mammalian brains with undercare, and we underdevelop care and love and playfulness. And so when we come to a situation, those enhanced systems are primary. We approach others with fear, as I mentioned, or oppositionalism, kind of an angry, I can't trust you. Distrust just becomes part of the atmosphere, and that extends not only to people but to the natural world. And we're encouraged then by the culture to think these things too. It's like everyone's selfish and aggressive. Beware, nature is dangerous and out to get you, all that stuff that enhances those same feelings that we have. But again, it's rationalizations, it's people who have been misdeveloped who are telling us all these things. They're unnested.
So I absolutely love this comparison chart that you've made of your observations between uncivilized and civilized societies, or indigenous societies versus traditional westernized societies. I would love for you to elaborate on what you found in this comparison. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, what I do is compare. This is in my book, Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality. I look at what I call Aboriginal primal wisdom, which is what develops from the ground up in these societies that provide the nest. And then I look at compare that with traditional wisdom, which is the religious traditions in the West. It's probably worldwide, but I focus in on the Western wisdom traditions of how you develop a wisdom as an adult, right? So you've got people in the West who are misdeveloped. They reach adulthood and they want to be more spiritually focused. They want to be more tuned in, more regulated, more virtuous. And then they go through all these spiritual practices to get there. Whereas in our traditional society, in the ancestral context of the nest provision, these things develop naturally. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of the whole system, from the early nest through the adolescent nest through the nest of adults, where there's lots of community rituals and practices that help you stay focused and connected. And so the shared properties, both forms of wisdom, uh, consider wisdom to exist beyond intellect. So, intellect is the thinking mind that we emphasize all the time in the Western world. We think that's the pinnacle of being a human being. It's actually quite dangerous in these other traditions because you can start to think that you're just a thinker and you forget that you are an animal. You forget that you have emotions,
Yeah.
that you have relationships, because you can go just lock yourself in your ivory tower thinking and whoops, make a lot of bad decisions and take a lot of bad actions like we've seen in the last 100 years, 200, 300 years, especially. So other shared properties are wisdom accesses other realms. That means the reality we see day to day, this material world, is just one. one often called illusory, right? Illusion. And there are other realms that wisdom is able to access. Practice involves surrendering to the energy realm of the world, the dynamic energy flows all around us. And ego detachment is necessary for this, not having a big ego, which are not unnested practices create big egos. Whereas you don't see big egos in the nested communities. Wisdom is state dependent. It matters what mood you're in. If you are in a fearful mood, you're not going to be wise, for example. And love is primary. Fear has to be overcome. And we have special responsibilities. Now, then there's some really important differences between primal wisdom and traditional wisdom.
And this is
The
what I
target
just love.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. And the target of your compassion in the traditional wisdom is other people, that it's, very anthropocentric. Whereas in primal wisdom, it's all of the natural world. You have to be feeling connected to this tree, this river, these animals in your community. It's very locally landscape, placeful kind of way of being. And your compassion then is for all forms of life in those situations, not just people. And what really is important here is what you fear in traditional wisdom, in westernized industrial civilization, is you fear your animal nature. Why would that be? Well, you've created all these undercared for babies, and they scream a lot, or the children are, very dysregulated, self-centered, because you've undercared for them, and the adults are kind of bad too, right? But in the primal wisdom view, the worst thing is to be alienated from your animal nature, to not know who you are as an animal, as an earth creature, as part of this bio community.
I love these findings because you can absolutely see how this is connected to the destruction of our biosphere right now.
Yes,
And
yes.
so, my closing question to you is, what advice can you give for this great conundrum we face and the lack of support from society to rear into our world better, more caring human beings? And how, in your opinion, does this connect to the current destruction of our biosphere?
Yes, so these are questions. Depends on what your role is in life or what your place where you are. If you can, drop out of the rat race, right? And don't feel, desire less, want less material goods, and then learn to be present to the natural world around you. So that means you might have to make a wildlife garden in your yard or something where you can actually see the birds and the chipmunks and the squirrels and the other wildlife around you, and you can learn to appreciate it. Now, if you can't do those things, there are other, and then, oh, well, if you're a parent, that too is it's important to let go of those high expectations for this or that and invest in that young child. Those first 5 years, so important. Then after that, then go ahead and do whatever it is that you want to do, but put those things on hold, want less, have a smaller home, have less material goods. You don't need the latest iPhone. I mean, you have to reorder your priorities and focus in on nurturing that unique spirit of your child. No one else can do it. No one else is there, and no one is like your child. Are you going to send them off to daycare when they're a baby and then haphazardly get them raised? You don't know what experiences they're having. They're certainly not going to be nurturing. Our daycare system is terrible in the States. So and especially for babies need to be with their caregivers, carried and held and kept in optimal arousal so their brain develops well. So they're not going to be an annoying person when they grow up. So it depends on where you are, but I encourage everyone when I give my talks to reestablish your nature connection. That means spend times belly breathing and imagining your favorite places to be in the natural world, a mountaintop, a forest, a beach, and feel that connection, feel how that supports you, that nature loves you as you are, and then find actual experiences too where you build that sense of nature connection. So I tell my students, it's surprising. I took them out on a cold day. Oh, well, let's just stand here in a circle now. Deep breathe, belly breathe, gets your vagus nerve going correctly. And then open your senses. What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you smell? And some of them later said, oh, I'd never heard birds. The
Oh my
birds singing.
goodness.
Oh, the
Uh-huh.
wind on my face, the sun, it's like, oh my
Oh
God. So we've
God.
undermined sensory development in so many ways because we spend so much time inside and in front of screens, which misdevelops your brain as a young child because you're not getting that back and forth intersubjective
Immersion in
dynamic.
nature.
Yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
dynamic nature of
Mm-hmm.
being in nature and with others who are alive.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing
Yeah.
that. So before we finish this interview, tell us about your newest book.
Ah, yes, our newest book is called Indigenous Sustainable Wisdom: First Nation Know-How for Global Flourishing.
What a
And
title.
I know.
Awesome.
It's came out of a conference we had a few years ago with a lot of Native American speakers, American Indian, First Nations. And so I'm the first editor on it, and it has various chapters on various things on how to reconnect and what the Indigenous worldview is, and how it's a great immersion book, I think, for understanding and stepping into the different worldview that we need to readopt.
Thank you. So I have a standard question I ask all my guests. Could you share with us a special connection or experience you have made in nature, whether recent or as a child?
Well, we have a yard with 50 trees of various ages, and my sense of connection is very deep in this yard. When I came to South Bend, Indiana, I had come from living in a condo and was looking for a condo, but they were more expensive, and very few. And so we bought this house, and I thought, oh my, what are we going to do with this yard? Blah, 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 blah. But over the years now, I've realized I put down roots here. And we have oak trees that are maybe 200 years old. And so I talk to them. The land has
Oh.
given me a song for this space to sing to them. It just came. And it's something that I treasure every day, to be able to look out whatever season it is and say hello to the trees here, to the plants we're taking out invasive plants and putting in native plants. And so I try to keep in conversation with the plants here and with the animals.
Thank you so much. You just gave me goosebumps, made me cry. It's
Well,
hard.
it's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, Darcia.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
We can learn a lot from the animal kingdom. We are, after all, part of that kingdom. African elephants are a great example of exemplary nurturers to their young. Living among matriarchal societies, other females take part in regular, affectionate contact with new calves. Their nest is built upon enormous support. Older members of the group will even adjust their pace so that the youngest of the herd can keep stride. All the while leading up to this episode, I have watched a pair of killdeer birds who have nested in my front yard. I have watched as each parent takes turns sitting on and tending the nest. They do so with such consistency, switching out every 30 minutes. Just as other species tend to their young with such diligence, we must remember to tend our own species' primal nest. For a broken nest does not yield a secure future. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.